Resume recording.
Don't stop. Oh.
So welcome here, everyone. How did we get from the Bible to the genocide in Gaza? The response to this webinar in 3 parts, offered by Mennonite Church Canada Palestine Israel Network and Mennonite Central Committee Manitoba, has been incredible. We welcome each and every one of you here to this time and space and place to consider how faith, the biblical text, and context have shaped one of the most apocalyptic realities in real time. Real people, precious, irreplaceable Palestinian lives, 2 million trapped, exploded, deliberately starved, and some say forgotten. This reality is also about Jewish people living in the land called both Palestine and Israel. We know that they suffered from centuries of anti-Semitism in Europe, as well as in Canada, the US, Russia, and elsewhere. This anti-Semitism culminated in the horrifying tragedy of the Holocaust during the Second World War. Let's remind ourselves of the responsibility to bear witness to suffering, to bear witness to resilience, and to the worth and dignity of every human life. In doing so, may we acknowledge our gathering on the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge and affirm that settlers have specific responsibilities in the journey of reconciliation to the original peoples of these lands and to our Mother Earth. As those longing to follow Jesus' example, to love our neighbor as ourselves, may we seek to disarm structures of oppression in order that all God's people and creation might experience truth and mercy, justice and peace. We who live on treaty lands or unceded territory give thanks to Creator and to those who have lived in sacred relationship to the lands for generations. Mennonite Church Canada Palestine Israel Network is moving into our 10th year anniversary. It was a mandate given to us by Mennonite Church Canada to educate and act for justice and solidarity with Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims, Jews, and many others working for an end to genocide and the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. None of us are free until all of us are free. Tonight, we will listen to the presentation for the first hour, and then there will be time for questions and answers. The chat function has been disabled, but you can type your questions throughout the presentation into the chat box, the Q&A box. And then I will present these questions, as many as I can, to Dan in the last half hour before ending the event at 8:30. The 3 series lectures will be recorded and they will be accessible after the fact. So now I want to introduce our speaker. Dan Epp-Tiessen, Dr. Dan Epp-Tiessen, is retired from teaching Bible and theology at Canadian Mennonite University after 26 years. He is grateful for ongoing opportunities to live out his vocation of teaching and preaching the Bible and Christian faith, especially without assignments to mark in the evenings. Dan is active in solidarity efforts to resist Israel's settler colonial oppression of Palestinians and its genocide in Gaza. Dan enjoys gardening, birdwatching, camping, biking, exercising, and spending time with his wife, Esther, as well as their children and grandchildren. Dan, thank you so much for your willingness to present this 3 Wednesday series with us. Bless you.
Hey, thank you so much, Joanna, for that introduction and that opening. And thank all of you, dear folks, for being here. It is so exciting that so many of you are interested in this topic. So I hope that we have great conversations together. Okay, history is complex. So there are many factors that go into something as complex as the genocide in Gaza. But the Bible is a huge factor. And I'm convinced that without the Bible, the genocide in Gaza would not be happening. So, how did we get from the Bible to genocide in Gaza? And we're gonna look at three different avenues. Tonight, we're gonna look at the Bible's land promises and the impact that they have had. All of these passages where God promises to give the land of Canaan to Abraham and Sarah and their descendants forever. Then next week, we're going to look at Christian anti-Semitism and how it utilized New Testament passages that are critical of Jewish people, Jewish leaders, to create this really vicious Christian anti-Semitic theology, because it was the fear of anti-Semitism that created the Zionist movement. In the 1800s, there were Jewish leaders in Europe that said Jews are not safe in Europe. We need to create our own Jewish state. And they did. And as they created that Jewish state, Palestinians were dispossessed of their lands and their homes. As a result, there was Palestinian resistance and organizations like Hamas. And we get October 7th, and we get Israel's genocide in response. And then thirdly, third week, we're going to look at Christian Zionism and the way it reads the Bible. And it was Christian Zionists in Britain that helped the Jewish Zionists actually create their state of Israel and facilitate the dispossession of Palestinians. And in the last few decades, it's been American Christian Zionists who have created this massive lobby movement in the US. So that's one of the factors why the US is just so totally committed to supporting the state of Israel no matter what. In the last 2 years, the US has given something like $12 billion of military aid to Israel. And the bombs dropped on Gaza, we know where they come from. Okay, so we're going to explore all these three in detail. Okay, by way of an introduction, I'm going to consistently use the term genocide as I have started to do. It's a harsh term. And I deliberately use that harsh term as a way to open our eyes to the extent of the harm, the destruction, and the evil of what has been happening in Gaza. So, why do I use the term? Well, because of the United Nations definition of genocide. This is not the full definition, but genocide involves the intent to destroy, in whole or in part a national, ethnic, or religious group as such, using a variety of means. Well, killing members of the group. We know that 68,000 bodies have been counted in Gaza, but of course that's the tip of the iceberg. It doesn't count all of those bodies that are rotting under the rubble. It doesn't count the people who died of starvation, malnutrition, people who died of infections, diseases that could easily have been treated had Israel not been blockading medicine. It doesn't include all those grandparents who, when their family was able to get a few scraps of food, they said, we'll just give the food to the grandchildren. And the grandparents starved to death. Number two, causing bodily or mental harm to members. Well, we've seen these kinds of pictures. Gaza turned into a moonscape. 90% of the homes in Gaza destroyed, or something like that. Constant bombardment for 2 years, people having to move time after time after time. And even when they're in what are called safe zones, they get bombed and killed anyway. Starvation, blockade of food for months on end, blockade of medicine so that doctors had to perform amputations without anesthetics. We've heard those kinds of stories. And deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life intended to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Israel's actions from the beginning demonstrated that it was intent on destroying life in Gaza or destroying the possibility of decent human life in Gaza. One of the first things Israel did was to bomb the entire water system, sewer system, electrical grid in Gaza. Very quickly, Israel destroyed every university in Gaza. Where are Gaza's future doctors, engineers, technicians, nurses, teachers going to come from? The key people that are fundamental to a healthy society. Um, Israel destroyed almost all of the hospitals, destroyed almost all the farmland. Surprisingly, up until 2 years ago, Gaza produced a significant amount of its own fruits and vegetables. No longer that farmland has been destroyed or poisoned. As I said, 90% of the housing in Gaza destroyed. This destruction is very intentional, um, and that it amounts to genocide. And there's deliberate intention. Multiple Israeli politicians have talked about utterly destroying Gaza. And the goal for many of them is actually to empty Gaza of Palestinians. But up to this point, they have not been able to find any country that will take the 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza. It was very telling on the evening when Prime Minister Netanyahu announced the ground invasion of Gaza. In part of that speech, he said, "And we remember what Scripture tells us about Amalek." There's apparently a tradition in Israel of calling Palestinians Amalekites. The Amalekites were a people who attacked the ancient Israelites just after they left the land of Egypt during their exodus. And so they're the quintessential enemy of God's people. They attack the Israelites when they're vulnerable. And the Israelites under Joshua are able to defeat the Amalekites. But after that battle, God tells the Israelites, or tells Moses, once the Israelites get established in the land of Canaan, they must annihilate the Amalekites. And that command is then later reiterated to Israel's first king Saul through the prophet Samuel. Go and annihilate the Amalekites. And so when Prime Minister Netanyahu says, our scripture tells us what we must do to Amalek, the Amalekites, he is calling for genocide. Hence, it's a genocide. Okay, before I go any further, I have to give a definition because I'm going to use this term over and over again in these sessions. Zionism, Jewish Zionism. It is a movement that began in Europe in the late 1800s that encouraged Jewish people to move to Palestine, i.e., in other words, to colonize Palestine. And the goal was to establish a Jewish state there. The argument was Jews are not safe in Europe because of anti-Semitism, and that would, of course, prove to be all too true. And so the goal was move to Palestine in large numbers and create a Jewish state there, even though it was well known that Palestine was fully occupied by Palestinians. Now, there have been different sort of brands of Zionism. There's a more compassionate, liberal brand of Zionism that advocates for peaceful coexistence between Jews and Palestinians. And there have always been much more militant Zionists who have always, the goal has always been the expulsion of Palestinians. So in terms of how the Zionist movement actually unfolded and the history of the State of Israel unfolded, the militant Zionists have always had greater political and obviously military clout, and we'll see some of that moving forward. Okay, Jeff Helper. He is an American-born Jewish Israeli, an anthropologist. He is a leading Jewish activist in Israel, calling for Israel to treat Palestinians justly. And to sort of understand the situation in Palestine, he uses the analogy of illness. He says, Palestine is sick. And Hamas's actions on October 7th and the atrocities it committed is a symptom of that sickness. And the Israeli genocide ever since then is also a symptom of that sickness. Now, when you have symptoms, okay, you have a sore stomach, a sore abdomen, uh, you go to the doctor, and what you need is a diagnosis. Is your stomach pain, a result of food sensitivities, uh, uh, colon cancer, appendicitis? You need the diagnosis because without a correct diagnosis, you can't get the correct treatment. So, in order to bring about a situation in Palestine where Jews and Palestinians will be able to live together side by side peacefully, with justice, with mutual prosperity, for that to happen, the starting place needs to be a correct diagnosis of what's going on in Palestine. What is the illness here? And of course, one diagnosis of the illness is that, the Palestinians in Gaza, they're all a bunch of anti-Semites. They get Nazified, they get portrayed as the most recent iteration of Nazism, and they want to destroy all Jewish Israelis. That's one diagnosis. And that's, of course, the diagnosis that has brought us to the genocide in Gaza. Jeff Halper says that's a misdiagnosis. The correct diagnosis is that the illness that afflicts Palestine is Israeli settler colonialism. And there are many, many commentators and scholars that make that same argument. Um, By the way, Canada also has a bad case of settler colonialism that also needs some serious treatment, and I'm going to talk about that also as we move ahead to help us understand Israeli settler colonialism. Okay, what is settler colonialism? Um, uh, First of all, settler colonialism it's a process. It's a process that created a certain type of nation state, like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and Israel. These are the main ones. And these states came into being after European powers conquered large tracts of land, and then over a lengthy process, in most cases, filled these lands with settlers. And these settlers, of course, the land was never empty. And the settlers took most of the land from the indigenous peoples. And then they created their own nation states. So the primary reality in these kinds of states is, first of all, colonization and settlement. Hence the term settler colonialism. To help you see what's going on here, think of India, for example, where the situation is very different. Even though India was conquered, colonized by the British and the British Empire, but Britain never filled India with European settlers. And so when India got its independence, um, India is still very Indian, and Indians own the land, control the government, and so forth, which is very different than the kind of reality we see in settler colonial states. Okay, secondly, once it gets established, settler colonialism becomes a structure and a system. A structure that shapes the basic political, economic, social, legal, military realities in these nation states. And the system is set up so that it benefits settlers a whole lot more than it benefits indigenous peoples. Just think of settler colonialism in Canada. Who owns virtually all the land and certainly all the good farmland in Canada? Who controls the government, the educational system, the courts, the economy? Settlers or indigenous folks, right? And in Palestine, Israel, Palestine, who makes all the important political decisions? Who controls the borders? Who has the powerful military? Who controls the all-important water resources? Uh, for the benefit primarily of whom? Um, and who has taken and controls most of the good farmland in Palestine? Okay, settler colonialism, it is also a tool of analysis, widely used now, especially in historical studies, but also in anthropology, sociology. A tool of analysis that highlights and explores how settler colonial states came into being, and then also how they are maintained as a result of forces like racism, colonialism, violent conquest, land theft, and other injustices inflicted on indigenous peoples. So, settler colonialism highlights settler power and privilege, and also how indigenous people get shafted in the settler colonial system. Okay, so there are a number of key dynamics that created settler colonialism and continue to maintain it. During the era of European colonization that began in the 1500s and lasted for at least 5 centuries, Europe developed what's called the doctrine of discovery. And in fact, there were papal pronouncements by the Catholic Pope to this effect that European Christians, they have the right to go anywhere in the world and conquer and claim territories for themselves if there aren't Christians living there, regardless of who else already lives there. And then these European Christian powers can take over and do whatever they want in these territories. And we know that the whole colonial enterprise was driven by basically European greed, the desire to conquer and control territories in order to extract wealth. I mean, the Spanish extracted massive amounts of silver and gold from Mexico, Central America, South America. But the goal was minerals, fish, furs, lumber, agricultural goods, and in Africa, slaves. And so it's through this doctrine of discovery, right? I mean, that's how Canada and US were created. And the doctrine of discovery is still a huge factor. It's the foundation of property law in Canada. So in Canada, land to which people like you and I don't have land titles, that kind of land is considered crown land. Why? Well, because the British Crown or somebody discovered it on behalf of the British Crown. So that land now belongs to, well, the Canadian government because it succeeds the British Crown. Why is it Crown land and not Indigenous land? When the Indigenous folks were here long before the British and others arrived? Doctrine of discovery, right? Now, the Jewish Zionist movement that emerged in the late 1800s, it came out of a European context where the doctrine of discovery was in the water that people drank. And the Zionist movement just simply absorbed the assumptions behind the doctrine of discovery. And so the Zionists, they just simply assumed, as European Jews, we can do the same thing that the British, the French, the Spanish did. We can go wherever we want, and we can take over the land, and we can settle it if we want, and we can create our own state there. Okay, so why do Europeans have the right to do that kind of thing? Well, it's rooted in a European arrogance, racism, and white supremacy. Um, Europeans are just more advanced, they're better than other folks in the world, and that's why they are entitled to take non-European territory. And in the whole history of colonization and settler colonialism, there's this dichotomy that the settlers, the Europeans, they represent civilization, advanced life, and the indigenous folks, they're savages, barbarians, they're uncivilized, they're backwards. They are in need of the civilization and enlightenment that Europeans have to offer. And I mean, that played out in Canada too, right? In terms of how the Canadian government treated indigenous peoples. Just think of the residential schools. The fundamental assumption there was that white settler ways are far superior. These indigenous folks, they're uncivilized savages. We need to kidnap their children, educate them in our white settler European ways, and get the Indianness out of them. That's the racism that undergirds settler colonialism. And again, the Zionist movement in Europe emerged when these kinds of ideas of white supremacy, racism, European arrogance, they were just everywhere. And they were just simply assumed. And people didn't realize how problematic they were. And so the Zionist movement just simply absorbed those ideas. And the Palestinians were the uncivilized, backwards barbarians. And that's why they could be treated in some pretty horrible ways. And that same kind of racism towards Palestinians, it's still reflected in the kind of rhetoric that one hears from a lot of Israeli politicians, calling Palestinians animals, snakes, calling them Amalekites, who presumably have to be genocided, eliminated. Um, um, so this racism gets absorbed into the very DNA of Zionism, and it has impacted how the Zionist movement has treated Palestinians from the beginning. And it plays, of course, a huge role in the genocide. So just think, for example, for a Zionist, how much is the life of a Palestinian child in Gaza worth compared to the life of a Israeli Jewish child in Tel Aviv, just 30, 40 kilometers away, right? There's no comparison between the worth of those two lives. Why? Racism. And of course, that same racism pervades the Western media and pervades Western perceptions of Palestinians. When a few Jewish people are killed in an anti-Semitic attack, as happened recently a few weeks ago in England, terrible, terrible thing. That's front page news for a few days in the West. But the killing of 100 Palestinians a day in Gaza, that's ignored. There's a deep racism in the West also towards Palestinians. Okay, this is a key factor. Europeans claim sovereignty over the land that they settle, and over the resources. And the outcome of that is, of course, the pushing indigenous people off the land through a process that involves huge amounts of violence, land theft. The goal of settler colonialism is always to acquire the land, as much of it as possible, and that means pushing the indigenous peoples off the land. So we see that in Canada, United States, right? The settlers claim we are sovereign here. We are the ones who have the rights to the land and the resources. And that's, of course, how our laws, industry, businesses, governments still operate largely in Canada and US. Okay. Settlers then, eventually, they create their own nation state. Once their numbers get big enough, they create their own state institutions, economic system, security forces, legal system. designed to serve largely settler interests and to keep indigenous peoples weak and unable to challenge the privileges and land holdings of the settlers. So in Canada, we have the Indian Act that places all kinds of limitations on indigenous people to keep them weak, and to solidify settler privilege. And the same thing happened in Israel. As the state of Israel is created, the institutions are designed to benefit Jewish Israelis, not Palestinians. Okay, fifth dynamic. Settler colonialism seeks to erase indigenous peoples. Now, that doesn't mean to just, kill them all, although that's sometimes done. There's all kinds of strategies that can be used to erase, render indigenous people invisible, insignificant, irrelevant, through many different strategies, often beginning with military conquest. So one of the strategies is, the rhetoric that, well, the land was empty. It was just waiting for European settlers to arrive. That was a lot of the rhetoric. That was how Canada advertised in Europe to get settlers to move to the Canadian prairies. The prairies were empty. There was no one living here, right? And what that means is there's no one of significance living there. Same thing happened in Israel-Palestine. There was an early Zionist slogan that Palestine was a land without people, for a people without land. Jewish people in Europe, because of anti-Semitism, were not allowed to own property in many places. So here finally was a land without people, for a people without land. Of course, that's a total lie. Palestine was very full of people, but not people who mattered. So this is how the erasure works. Some examples of how Israel has practiced erasure of Palestinians. So the State of Israel officially came into being in 1948. And one of the first things it did is there was a deliberate campaign of widespread ethnic cleansing, because to pursue three particular Zionist goals. One, to get more of the land from Palestinians. Secondly, to eliminate a large segment of the Palestinian population. The Zionist goal was always to create a Jewish state, not a biracial, bi-ethnic state or a multicultural state. But even to this day, Israel advertises itself as a Jewish state. And of course, if you're going to have a Jewish state, it can't be half full of Palestinians. So the demographics had to be changed. So Palestinians had to be eliminated in order to ensure the Jewish character of the state. So what happened is the Israeli soldiers would enter a town or village. They would shoot a few people to obviously terrorize the population, and then people were told to leave, forced to leave. And when they left, the houses were blown up or bulldozed. In many places, Jewish settlers moved into Palestinian homes, but at this point, there weren't enough Jewish settlers yet to fill them all. So there's something like 500 Palestinian towns, villages that were bulldozed. That's how erasure works. So about 750,000 Palestinians were forced out of Israel proper. They moved into refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt. Half the population of Jordan is now of Palestinian background. Even more Palestinians there was a total of about 1 million Palestinians that were displaced from their homes, their farms, their lands. Some of them remained internal within Israel, and there's still a significant Palestinian population within Israel. And of course, Gaza is full of the descendants of refugees from this Nakba. Nakba, Palestinian word that means disaster, catastrophe. Um, and these children of grandchildren of refugees, they can look through the fence out of Gaza and they see the lands where their ancestors used to farm and live, now occupied by Israeli Jews. No wonder the folks in Gaza are very, very angry and frustrated. The Nakba is an ongoing reality. So in 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank that used to belong to Jordan, exclusively occupied by Palestinians, and Israel forced an additional 200,000 Palestinians out of their homes and lands. And since 1967, we know that Israel has been aggressively building settlements in the West Bank, taking more and more land from Palestinians, more and more land theft, and that process has only ramped up after October 7th. So, what happens in this larger process of erasure is that indigenous concerns, interests get ignored, marginalized in favor of settler interests. And settlers draw the maps. And these maps legitimate settler land claims. And they often attach their own settler names to previous indigenous names. So after 1948, there was a major campaign to rename Palestinian places and give them Hebrew names. Mapping. I mean, think of the typical map of Canada. What's the most prominent feature? The provinces. Well, the provinces are a settler colonial feature, right? Um, having provinces as a central feature makes claims about who owns this land and who is in charge here, versus a map of Canada that shows the traditional territories of the various indigenous peoples. That makes very different claims about what kind of an entity Canada is. Um, So maps. Okay, here's a standard map of Israel that shows very clearly the Gaza Strip and the West Bank that, as I said, Israel conquered in 1967 and took it from Jordan. In Israel, it is illegal to use this kind of a map in the educational system. You have to use this kind of a map that erases the Palestinians. Notice the West Bank is gone. It's called Judea and Samaria, and that's the typical terminology used within Israel. So in the Israeli educational system, the students are indoctrinated to erase and eliminate Palestinians and their claims to the land. The West Bank belongs to Israel, as the map demonstrates. So the maps drive the kind of settler violence that we see in the West Bank. Okay, settler colonialism has a bad conscience, as well it should, about all the violence and injustice that's needed to establish it and to maintain the system. And so settler colonialism generates an ideological system of denial to justify the settler colonial system and to create a false narrative that denies or minimizes the settler colonial violence, the land theft, and the injustice. I think of how I learned Canadian history. Uh, I didn't learn about all the land theft, all of the broken treaties. I didn't learn about how the Canadian government tried to destroy Indigenous peoples and cultures through the whole residential school system. I just learned about residential schools in the last 15 years. There's been a powerful narrative in Canada that hides that hides our settler colonial violence from ourselves. I just had a conversation with somebody not so long ago. Is the residential schools, they were not that bad. They educated Indigenous children. They were not designed to destroy Indigenous peoples, right? That's the settler colonial narrative to cover up the violence, because we don't want to think we're bad people. We don't want to think that our ancestors did horrible things. We don't want to believe that we have benefited from horrific violence and injustice. So within Israel, there is a powerful narrative that does not face up to the Nakba. It didn't happen. The Palestinians that left in 1948, they left voluntarily. Um, they were not forced out. The Israeli Defense Forces is the most moral army in the world. Its snipers don't kill hundreds of civilians in Gaza. Its planes don't bomb entire families. They only target militants. Um, I mean, just something you can all watch is the CBC Fifth Estate produced a fantastic documentary called Funding the Occupation that looks at the settler violence in the West Bank happening right now and the connections to Canada. Anyway, there's a settler spokesman interviewed there, and she talks about a particular village that used to be Palestinian, and the Palestinians were all expelled, and it's now Israeli. And she just says there were no Palestinians living there. Um, that's the ideological system of denial. Okay, this man here, Ilan Pappé, written an absolutely fantastic book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He exposes and documents the Nakba in 1948 and 49 and how it happened and the extent of it. When his book was published, he faced enormous blowback. The Minister of Education at the time called for the University of Haifa to fire him. That's where he was a professor. He faced threats, death threats. He eventually had to take a job in England. And by the way, he uses a settler colonial analysis. Okay. Indigenous people will resist settler colonialism. Of course, they value their land, their communities, their way of life. That resistance, it can take nonviolent forms, or sometimes it is violent, and it will be more or less successful. In Canada, we're very fortunate that Indigenous people have just been incredibly peaceful in their resistance to settler colonialism, and they use our settler court system mostly they resist in all kinds of ways. But anyway, the settler colonial system will often deny that there are legitimate reasons for resistance. We didn't do anything wrong, right? So the state of Israel thinks of itself as we are a peaceful nation. We're not trying to hurt anybody. We're just trying to live here peacefully. And the whole process of land theft is covered up. And if the indigenous resistance is violent, the settlers will call it terrorism or irrational, barbaric. It's totally unmerited. But the escalated violence of the settler colonial system to suppress indigenous resistance, that's called virtuous self-defense. So the massive genocide in Gaza, well, Israel has a right to defend itself. That's the line, right? Gaza is full of terrorists. Israel must defend itself. So the genocide is virtuous self-defense. Now, Hamas's attack on October 7th, it involved some horrible atrocities. So I don't justify what Hamas did on October 7th. But we need to understand the illness. The illness here is settler colonialism. Settler colonialism will create resistance. Hamas is a Palestinian resistance movement to Israeli settler colonialism. Had Israeli settler colonialism not stolen the land from Palestinians, Hamas would never exist, and it would never have broken out of the prison of Gaza on October 7th and did some pretty horrible things. So Hamas is an anti-colonial resistance movement, and anti-colonial resistance often takes some pretty nasty, ugly forms. If you look at the history of anti-colonial wars, whether it's in Kenya, Mozambique, Angola, other places, there's far too much violence and far too many atrocities on all sides. But if we want to talk terrorism, I mean, who has committed more terrorism in the last 2 years? Hamas or the Israeli Defense Forces? Okay, so in Canada, we're quite fortunate that we're just beginning to challenge our settler colonialism. Right. When, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission dealt with the residential schools, there's a lot of truth telling. And there's been a lot of truth telling since then about settler colonial realities in Canada. We are just beginning to address some of these realities and to rectify them. In Israel, Palestine, things are moving in the opposite direction. Israel is doubling down on its settler colonialism, and it is in fact becoming more violent and genocidal. In Gaza, we see a rapid genocide. In the West Bank, we see a slow motion genocide. But in the West Bank, the goal is for Israel to take all of the good farmland and to fence Palestinians into a few large Palestinian cities, which is also, in a sense, a form of genocide because it's going to destroy the foundation of life of the Palestinian people. Okay, here's a map showing the sort of the expansion of Israeli settler colonialism. The white areas, um, the 1947, just a few areas where Jewish settlers predominated over Palestinians. Then the second map, this was what the UN partition plan was, that there would be two states. Israel would get the white area, Palestinian state would get the green areas. The white area is obviously not a very viable state, but that was the UN plan. After 1948-49, there was a short war between Palestinians and Zionists. The Zionists were able to expand their territory. The UN brokered a truce, and things ended up the way you see in the third map. The fourth map is kind of the reality today. In 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank and has rapidly been taking over more and more land in the West Bank. So you see the trajectory that's happening here. And the goal of Zionist settler colonialism is to get all the land with the minimum number of Palestinian people in it. Okay, so I said we talk about the Bible. Okay, what's the Bible got to do with all of this? The Bible inspired and shaped European settler colonialism. Important to remember, for centuries and centuries, Christendom dominated Europe, right? That European countries were officially Christian. That means the Bible was a sacred, authoritative book. It shaped people's faith, beliefs, and imagination in powerful ways. And what do we see in the Bible? Over and over again, God makes promises, and God promises to give the land of Canaan, the land of Palestine, to Abraham and his descendants. So many passages are like this. Here's another one. Interestingly, this passage occurs in a context where the text has just told us that the land is full of Canaanites. And yet God promises to give it to Abraham and his offspring forever, forever. So the promise is first made to Abraham, and then in the next generation to Isaac, and then in the third generation to Jacob. And this creates what's called the promise and fulfillment theme, and raises the question, so how will God fulfill these promises to give the land to the people of Israel? And so between when God makes the promise and when God fulfills the promise, there's a long detour, and the Israelites spend 400 years in the land of Egypt. But then God liberates them from Egyptian slavery, leads them on a grand exodus. And of course, one of the main goals of that exodus is to acquire the land of Canaan. So the book of Deuteronomy prepares the Israelites for entry into the land of Canaan, and Deuteronomy tells them how it's going to happen. God's going to go ahead of you like a devouring fire, and God will destroy the Canaanites and subdue them, and then you can finish the job and you can annihilate them. And then you can take over the land. In modern terms, this amounts to genocide and ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism. And there's no way that we should try to deny that or to sugarcoat that. So the book of Joshua then, that tells us about how this process unfolded, has many passages like this. So the Lord gave Lachish, the town of Lachish, into Israel's hands. Joshua conquered it, and then he executed all the people who lived there. And so we get over and over again, we get statements like this. And then at the end, sort of the process, we get this summary statement. So Joshua subdued the whole region. He left no survivors, totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Because God fought for Israel. And then in the chapters that follow, these chapters describe how the Israelites divvied up the land between all of the different tribes. Now, historically, we know the process was not nearly this simple, much more complex. The Canaanites were, in fact, not annihilated. You go to the next book after Joshua, the book of Judges, and there's Canaanites running around everywhere. But that doesn't matter. I mean, that's not how the story is told in Joshua. And it's this story that shaped European vision and imagination in some very, very powerful ways. Now, these texts are very theologically, ethically problematic. We're just going to have to skip that. Yeah, we don't have time to talk about that. But these passages, as I said, they shaped the European Christian vision and imaginations. And because of European anti-Semitism, Christians believed that they had replaced the Israelites, the Jewish people, as God's chosen people. That means that all of the promises that God makes to the Israelite people in the Bible, those promises, they don't apply to the Jewish people anymore. They apply to Christians and the church. And what does God do in these passages? God promises God's people land. And so the European Christians thought God is promising us the land of Turtle Island, all of the lands that the Europeans had their eyes set on. And the whole doctrine of discovery is based on this conviction that Christians, European Christians, are God's chosen people, and God gives them land. And therefore, they can go anywhere and conquer the land. Look what the Israelites do in the book of Joshua: genocide, ethnic cleansing. So if the local inhabitants, the indigenous folks, resist Europeans, well, Europeans can go and decimate them. And that's, of course, what happened in many, many different places. So these biblical texts played a huge role in shaping the doctrine of discovery and the whole European colonization program and the settler colonial process. We know that, I mean, there were Christian preachers in Canada, United States, that talked about the indigenous people as the Canaanites. And of course, we know what the Bible says to do to Canaanites, right? And what these Christian preachers were doing is that they were encouraging their fellow settlers to go out, conquer the Canaanites, and take the land. So these convictions so these biblical passages shaped European doctrine of discovery, colonial mentality, settler colonial mentality. And the Jewish Zionist movement emerged out of that context and just absorbed these biblically inspired settler colonial beliefs. And so that's why I say the the genocide in Gaza wouldn't be happening if it weren't for these the Bible's land passages and conquest passages. So that's a little bit about how the biblical land texts and conquest stories impacted European settler colonialism, and through European settler colonialism shaped Zionist settler colonialism. But there's another story to follow, another storyline to follow, of how the biblical texts had a more sort of direct impact on the Zionist movement. So, to understand Jewish Zionism, it's important to understand what's called the diaspora, the dispersion of Jewish people around, well, Mediterranean world and then Europe and beyond, either voluntary or because of military conquest and displacement. Okay, so already long before the time of Jesus, there was widespread voluntary immigration of Jews to especially the urban areas around the Mediterranean basin, looking for better economic opportunities because it was always difficult to make a living in Palestine. So just as one example, Alexander the Great, Greek conqueror, conquered, a big swath of land from Greece all the way to India. And he wanted to build a city in his name, in his honor. So, to build a city of Alexandria in Egypt that still stands to this day. If you're going to build a city, you need citizens. He invited Jews to come and be some of the folks who would populate this new city. And a lot of Jews took him up on that offer. And that's how Alexandria in Egypt became a major center of Jewish life. So, by the time of Jesus, um, there were something like 4.5 to 7 million Jews in the Roman Empire. They had a lot of children. Children are a special blessing from God. But only a minority of Jews lived in Palestine, maybe something like 1 or 2 million. Obviously, I mean, these are very, very rough estimates. So the majority of Jews, by the time of Jesus, had left Palestine voluntarily. Okay. Then the Roman Empire was not very kind to Jewish people, and as a result, there were 2 major Jewish revolts against the empire. The Roman Empire was absolutely brutal in crushing those revolts. In the first revolt, they destroyed Jerusalem. Both revolts, they destroyed many, many towns, villages. Many Jews were simply massacred. Thousands and thousands were sold into slavery. And after the second revolt, the Romans were so fed up with Jewish resistance that they expelled almost all Jews from Palestine. So it was an absolutely horrible, horrible experience. Now, one of the key elements of the Zionist claim to Palestine is that the Jews were forcibly evicted, forcibly expelled from Palestine. And because they were forcibly expelled, they have a right to go back to what is their homeland. That's a very partial truth. Yes, significant number of Jews were forcibly expelled, but the vast majority of Jews had long before that already voluntarily left Palestine. Um, uh, anyway, for many centuries, the Jewish community in Palestine was very small, probably less than 10,000, and Judaism made peace with living in diaspora. And until about the middle of the 20th century, most Jews did not believe that living in the land of Israel was central to their faith. That's a very new development, basically a result of the Holocaust, and we'll talk about that story next week. And until the late 1800s, there was no movement to encourage Jews to return to Palestine and settle there. And that small small Jewish community that lived in Palestine, they spoke Arabic. They got along very well with their neighbors. There's all kinds of stories about how Jews and Muslim Palestinians, Christian Palestinians lived side by side peacefully. Um, okay, so some of the key factors that nurtured this Jewish Zionist movement. The surge of anti-Semitism in Europe in the 1800s that made Europe unsafe for Jewish people. That was the main factor. Especially there was a rise in anti-Semitism, attacks on Jewish community, pogroms in the Russian Empire, where there were huge numbers of Jews living. About 1 million Jews fled the Russian Empire. A lot of them ended up in Canada and especially in the U.S. Um, uh, the 19th century in Europe was the era of nationalism. As nation states formed to bring together, people who shared an ethnic and cultural identity. Hungary for the Hungarians, Germany for the Germans. Well, a lot of Jews became nationalists and thought we need a Jewish state for Jewish people. And then there was the Jewish acceptance of all the problematic ideas that undergirded other settler colonial projects. I mean, if the British and French and Spanish can go and conquer places and settle their own people there, well, why can't we do the same thing? Okay. And then God's promises in the Bible to grant the land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants forever. And of course, that long history of the Israelite people in the land that establishes this deep, deep connection between the Jewish people and the land of Palestine. Okay, Theodore Herzl. I'm getting very close to the end here, and then we'll allow time for Q&A. Father of modern Zionism, he was not the first or the only one to have the vision of a Jewish state, but he was the one who was able to put wheels on it. He traveled widely across Europe, speaking wherever he could, meeting with Jewish leaders. He lobbied European political leaders to support the project. He raised funds. He organized local committees to get people on board. And he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. And this group met yearly to drum up support for the Zionist cause and to begin organizing it to make it happen. They began to raise money to buy land and to help Jewish people actually move to Palestine. Now, one of the early Zionist debates was whether the new Jewish state had to actually be in Palestine. The early Zionists were secularists. They were not religious Jews. And so Palestine was under the control of the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey. It had absolutely no interest in allowing Jewish people to create a Jewish state in Palestine. And so some of the Zionists began to consider other options. Well, Uganda, they negotiated with the British about Uganda, Argentina, which illustrates how Zionism was a colonial project that just assumed Europeans, we can go wherever we want and stake our claim and create our own state there. But the Zionists very quickly realized that if their movement was going to get any traction, especially with religious Jews, it was going to have to be Palestine, the Bible's land promises, the biblical story, where there is this deep, deep bond between the Jewish people and the land, and how their identity is linked to the land. And so very quickly, the Zionist movement realized it has to be Palestine. So again, the Bible made the choice of where the Zionists would go. It just had to be Palestine and where the Palestinians live. Just two more slides. to illustrate, I've said, that Zionism was a racist project, colonial project right from the beginning. So here's Herzl speaking to the Duke of Baden. Jews returning to their historic fatherland would do so as representatives of Western civilization. And I love this, bringing cleanliness, order, and well-established customs of the Occident, that is Europe, to this plague-ridden, blighted corner of the Orient. Here you have the colonial mentality, right? Europe represents civilization, cleanliness, order, good customs. The Orient, the area to be settled is plague-ridden, it's blighted, it's in desperate need of the civilization, order, and cleanliness that only European settlers can bring. That's the kind of ideology that motivated settler colonialism in many, many different places, including Palestine. One other slide. Herzl and other Zionists, they knew very well that Palestine was not empty. It was full of Palestinians, and that raised, what are we going to do with them, right? So this is what Herzl wrote in his diary at one point. Once Jews have occupied the land and expropriated the private property. Notice the goals. We're going to get the land and expropriate the private property. Then we shall endeavor to expel the poor population across the border unnoticed. In other words, we're going to get rid of the Palestinians. But we're going to do it in such a way that Europeans won't see what we're doing because they won't look favorably upon that. And we'll get employment for them in the transit countries. That's code language for the countries where we kick them out to. But we're not going to give them employment in our own country because it's all about creating a Jewish state. So right from the get-go, the leading Zionists were intent on expelling the Palestinians. Okay, so the summary, Israel is a settler colonial state, and this settler colonialism has been powerfully impacted by the Bible's land texts, land promises, and the history of the Israelite people in the land. And without this Zionist settler colonialism, there would have been no Palestinian resistance, there would be no Hamas, no October 7th, and no subsequent genocide. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you so much, Dan.
You're welcome. There must be some questions by now.
There's a few. I was just trying to find this quote that I'm having here I am. That I posted from Ben-Gurion, sort
Oh,
of the
yeah.
father of the state of Israel, saying that it was only natural for the indigenous peoples of Palestine to resist because the Zionists are taking everything they have. So of course, why wouldn't they resist? It was just a given, right? Of course, they were going to ensure that resistance was put down, but he just seemed to assume that it wasn't, and it was a normal thing to do if somebody comes and takes your property.
Yeah, that was Zeb Jabotinsky, the
Ah,
father of the Likud party, which is Benjamin Netanyahu's political party.
okay.
And yeah, he said, oh, of course, wherever the colonists have gone, the indigenous people resist and they fight because they love their land and they're going to fight you for it. But he was a hardline Zionist who said that just means we got to get rid of the Palestinians.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there
Yeah.
you go.
All right. Well, we do have some very interesting questions. I'm going to get to as many as I can. We'll start with this one. You are thanked for the presentation. Do you have any suggestions for handling some of these scripture references, the promises to Abraham, Book of Joshua, especially in today's context? How can we speak into these passages in churches in a way that challenges Christian Zionist narratives that often is the default in our churches?
Uh, that's a great question. You know what? I'm going to kick that one down the road because during our third session, I want to spend about 10 minutes answering exactly that question.
Okay.
Yeah, what do we do with all of these Bibles, the Old Testament land promises? So I've got a 10-minute section I'm going to do in the third session. So, um, yeah, sorry, but I'll just say a few things. Um, if we, as Christians, we read the whole Bible through the New Testament and Jesus, and neither Jesus nor Paul nor any New Testament writer is the least bit interested in the establishment of a powerful Jewish geographic state. The reason is that God's agenda, in the Old Testament, God's agenda is to create the chosen people, and that's going to require a piece of real estate. That's going to require a land. In the New Testament, the things sort of broaden out, and Jesus comes to establish the kingdom or the reign of God on earth. And this reign of God is now open to all people. And so the goal is no longer just one people in one promised land. The vision is of the people of God that spread across the whole globe.
Okay, thanks. There was another question kind of along similar lines, but it was asking about the passages you read that many of us find difficult to hear, and why, or if there was another interpretation that wasn't so slanted towards sort of the settler colonial narrative or the negative narrative around settler colonialism. Is there another way to interpret those passages?
No.
Okay.
My approach to difficult biblical passages, I've seen this over and over again, where biblical interpreters, because of respect for the Bible and because of the role of Bible in shaping Christian faith, man, when the Bible says something problematic, it can't possibly say that. So we kind of ignore what the Bible really says and we make the text say what we wish it should say, or we make the text say what it really should say. Um, I don't think that's honest. My approach is to respect the biblical text enough to hear what it says, and then to also respect it enough to say, I will disagree with you. And so I think Christian faithfulness requires us to disagree with some of these biblical texts. And we see that playing itself out in the Bible itself. On many issues, the Bible is in conversation and debate with itself. Um, so you see that, for example, with respect to marriage. In the early part of the Bible, a man can have as many wives as he can support. Uh, but by the end of the biblical tradition, marriage is understood as a covenant relationship between two people. Um, so there's a conversation and a debate going on in the Bible, and we don't take our Christian ethics from just a single biblical text. We have to read and interpret that biblical text in light of the larger biblical story. And it's no accident that, I mean, Jesus, he quotes the Old Testament or alludes to the Old Testament almost every time he opens his mouth. Um, but it's no accident that I don't think Jesus ever quotes any of the settler colonial texts in the Bible.
Hmm.
Jesus uses his scripture quite selectively. Um, so he'll quote texts like, when he's asked what's the greatest commandment, he quotes Deuteronomy 6, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and strength. And the second commandment is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's from somewhere in Leviticus. Um, but you never find Jesus, quoting texts about we really need to annihilate all these Canaanites.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question here for thought. What portion of Zionists actually believe in God?
I have no idea. Uh, uh, I have no idea. But and somewhere along the way in these sessions, we'll talk about how initially Zionism was largely a secular movement, partly because Many religious Jews did believe that someday Jewish people would be going back to the land of Palestine, but that would be in the day of the Messiah. It would be God's doing through the Messiah. And they saw what the secular Zionists were trying to do as an arrogant form of humans trying to do what's really the work of God. The Holocaust changed all of that. The Holocaust convinced Jews, many Jews, that the Zionist argument was right, that Jewish people need their own state in order to be safe. So that in the last decades now, for many, many Jews, Zionism and Jewish faith have become synonymous. For many Jews, not all, not all religious Jews. In fact, I've got a book on my shelf here behind me, written by a very, very pious Canadian Jewish professor from Montreal, who laments this fact that his beloved Jewish faith has been so thoroughly identified with Zionism because he thinks that's a real distortion of Jewish faith, which is based on adherence to Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. But what the statistics are, I have no idea.
Thanks, Dan. Well, I think it speaks to the fact that initially Zionism was a secular movement, and one interpretation I heard was that after the 67 war, certainly Christian Zionism grew because they saw that as a fulfillment of prophecy.
Right.
And the marriage between Christianity too and Zionism kind of
Yeah.
cemented itself there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have time for a couple more questions. Okay, so here's a question. Did the Palestinians give permission for Herzl and his followers to come and live with them in the late 1800s, or who allowed them to just show up
Oh,
in
absolutely not.
Palestine?
The Palestinians resisted the Zionist movement as soon as they became aware of what the Zionist goals were. Partly this, one of the first things the Zionists did is that they started to buy farmland. A lot of the land in Palestine was owned by absentee Arab landowners. And the Zionists were fundraising around the world for the Zionist project. So they used these funds to buy land initially. Now, these absentee landowners in Palestine, they have been, sometimes selling land to each other or to other folks. The understanding always was, though, when you did that, the tenant farmers went with the land. So that these Palestinian tenant farmers had long-term sort of occupancy on the land. And many of these absentee landowners, they sold out their own people, in effect. So if the Zionists offered them a good price for their land, they sold it to the Zionists. The Zionists then, of course, kicked off the tenant farmers because the whole goal was to get the land for Jewish settlers. And that's where some of the first conflicts started. And there was violence early on especially between these Palestinian farmers who had been displaced and the Zionists who were now on what they considered to be their land. And we'll talk more about this next week, but that Palestinians have been resisting the Zionist movement and its goals as soon as they became aware of what the Zionists were up to.
I have a question here from someone who's asking about Ilan Pappé. Would you recommend reading his History of Palestine?
I have not read that. I think that's a short book he published recently. I have not read that yet, but anything I've read from Ilan Pappé, anytime I've watched a webinar by him, it's absolutely brilliant. So I'd recommend pretty much anything that he writes or says.
Okay, I'm just sort of halfway through the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and I find it quite compelling.
Yeah, that's a brilliant book. Yeah.
Let's see here. Now, here's a question for some of us. Why do you think Christian Zionist views remain common, often implicit, within Mennonite churches? This person's coming from an outside denomination, and she was surprised and disheartened to discover this. Thoughts about why Mennonite Anabaptists get compelled by this theology?
I'm going to kick that one down the road. The whole last session is going to be on Christian Zionism and why it's compelling. So, yeah, I'm going to kick that one down the road.
Oh, here's a great one. These questions are all great. I'm not going to get to all of
Yeah,
them.
they're all good. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
they are. Do any Zionists acknowledge that Palestinians have claim to Palestine as well?
As I said, there are different sort of versions of Zionism. So, for example, Martin Buber, some of you may know that name. He was a well-known Jewish philosopher, very pious Jewish man. He was a Zionist. He moved to Jerusalem, I'm not sure, or moved to Palestine, I'm not sure when. He was a very compassionate Zionist and was convinced that in order to be true to Jewish faith, Zionism must uh, that Jews and Palestinians must coexist peacefully and respect each other and respect each other's rights to land and so forth. And there were others like him. That version of Zionism did not win out. It was the more militant forms of Zionism that won out. So, just for example, the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, uh, he was a very, very militant Zionism, and it was he and his fellow leaders who planned the Nakba. It was very intentionally planned and strategized. So that's the brand of Zionism that has won out.
And do you think anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's the equation that some Zionists try to make. They want to argue that if you're against Zionism, you're being anti-Semitic. I think that's absolutely incorrect for a number of reasons. There's many Jews who are not Zionist. There are many Jews who are very, very troubled and opposed to what the state of Israel is doing. So Jewishness is not synonymous with Zionism, and Zionism is a political movement, and all political movements are open to criticism or should be open to criticism. And so to criticize Zionism is not to be anti-Semitic. Although there are a lot of Zionist lobby groups who try to convince governments that the protesters who are shouting anti-Zionist slogans are in fact anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I would say that's a major concern that people who are advocating for human rights and to genocide and to occupation face is that the critique of the state of Israel is in fact anti-Semitic,
Yeah,
and it is a tool to shut down, the struggle for Palestinian self-determination,
yeah.
essentially.
Hmm.
I'm going to have throw out one more question for you, and then if you could just give folks a teaser for next week, that'd be good.
Okay.
Is it and I think this is an interesting question, and I think it's more philosophical than anything, but maybe folks can think about it as they leave as well. Is it possible to have a democratic state whose citizens are determined by religious beliefs?
I th I think any kind of if you're going to have a democratic state, by definition, you have to tolerate diversity and different perspectives. So I think it is possible to have a democratic state in which the majority of people have a particular religious persuasion, as long as the majority does not impose its ways and its will on the minority. Uh,
Right.
mhm.
Thanks, Dan. Okay,
Yeah.
what do we have to look forward to next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock?
Okay, anti-Semitism. We are going to look at how we're going to look at a number of the New Testament passages that are critical of Jewish leaders and Jewish people. And then we're going to look at how, in the first centuries of the church's history, the church's theologians used these biblical texts to create a horrible anti-Semitic theology that demonized Jewish people in all kinds of ways. And then once the Emperor Constantine turned the Roman Empire into, Christian, he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, then the empire began to enforce anti-Semitism. And the empire, the state, began to persecute Christians. And that was the situation up until the 1900s, or yeah, at least into the 1800s in Europe. And in the 1800s, there was a major rise in anti-Semitism in Europe. And that's what sparked the Zionist movement. And then the Holocaust came along, and that basically cemented the state of Israel. A massive number of new immigrants, and it changed Jewish perception. Up until the Holocaust, the vast majority of Jews did not support the Zionist cause. The Holocaust changed everything. And since then, the majority of Jews have supported the state of Israel, as have Western nations after the Holocaust because they felt guilty. So that's next week.
Okay, thanks so much, and thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to further conversation and further learnings next week. Take care, everybody.
Great. Thanks, Joe, for hosting.